Hello, class, and welcome to the second half of our lecture on visual and auditory processing. Within this section, we will be exploring the auditory side of the lecture, and I'd like to just kind of start off by walking us through what we'll be doing in this part. Essentially, we'll be taking a look at first off, I want to tell you a little bit of a story about Ernst Weber, and then we will get into our auditory processing. As far as auditory processing, the things I want to kind of dive into are, first off, the basic structures of the auditory system, as well as, if you recall, last part of the lecture, I mentioned a little bit about memory, and we talked a little bit about iconic memory, and then in this part of our lecture, we'll talk about echoic memory. We'll also unravel a little bit of the role of context in auditory pattern recognition, as well as some auditory illusions. So that's what we'll be doing in our this part of our lecture. So I'd like to kind of dive in first and highlight a little bit about the historical figure of Ernst Heinrich Weber, pioneering psychologist from the 19th century. So, Ernst Weber was born in 1795 in Wittenberg, Germany, and he made significant contributions to the field of psychophysics, if you recall that from the earlier part of this lecture, which examines the relationship between the physical stimuli and our psychological responses. Now, in 1834, Weber published a groundbreaking work that explored the ability to discriminate between two stimuli and different intensities, particularly in the realm of touch and sensation. And one of the most famous findings, now known as Weber's law, if you recall, Fechner, who was a student of Weber, really kind of popularized this, was the idea of the just noticeable difference, the JND, between two stimuli is proportional to the magnitude of the original stimulus. In simpler terms, this means that our ability to detect changes in stimuli, such as weight or brightness or pressure, is not constant, but rather depends upon the initial intensity of the stimulus. So while Weber primarily focused on tactile sensations, his work laid the foundation for the study of sensory perception across various modalities, including audition, which we'll explore in detail today. So Weber's insights into the relationship between stimulus intensity and perception really continues to influence our understanding of the sensory processing and provides a bridge between the fields of psychophysics and cognitive psychology. Now, to understand auditory processing, it's really crucial to first acquaint ourselves with the structures that make up the auditory system. Our sense of hearing is really remarkable, and it's an intricate process, clearly, that involves multiple stages from the reception of sound waves to the perception of meaningful auditory information. At the heart of the auditory system are the auditory receptors, which are located in the cochlea, a spiral-shaped fluid-filled structure in the inner ear. And these receptors, known as hair cells, are sensitive to vibrations caused by sound waves. And the journey really begins with the outer ear, consisting of the pinna, that visible part of the ear, and the ear canal. And the pinna helps to capture the sound waves and directs them into the inner ear canal. And as sound waves travel down the ear canal, they reach the middle ear, where the eardrum vibrates in response to the sounds. And this vibration is then transmitted to the three tiny bones of the middle ear, the oschalus, the hammer, the anvil, and the stirrup, which amplifies the sound. And the amplified vibrations are then transmitted to the cochlea, where the hair cells immersed in a fluid responds to the vibrations by bending their tiny hair-like projections. And this bending generates the electrochemical signals that travel along the auditory nerve to the brain. So from the cochlea, these electrochemical signals travel through the auditory pathways to the various parts of the brain, including the auditory cortex. And this is where the brain processes and interprets the signals as sound. And this allows us to perceive and make sense of the auditory world around us. So we need to I think it's important that we understand the anatomical structures in order to have a foundation for comprehending how we hear and process the sounds. Now that we've gained a basic understanding of the structures involved in auditory processing, let's delve into the fascinating aspect of the auditory system, what is called echoic memory. And this is really the sensory memory system that specifically pertains to auditory information. And this allows us to briefly retain and process sounds we've just heard. So similar to the iconic memory that briefly holds visual information, you can think of it as a brief echo of what you've heard, and hence the name. So echoic memory lasts longer than the iconic visual memory from the visual system. You recall the iconic memory lasts only 200 or 300 milliseconds, but echoic memory typically has a span of a few seconds, often around 3 to 4 seconds. And this gives the brain a short window to process and potentially encode the auditory information. So our echoic memory has a limited capacity, meaning that we can hold only a certain amount of auditory information for that brief duration. And this capacity is going to vary among individuals, but generally allows us to retain a few seconds worth of sound. And echoic memory is closely linked to our selective attention. When we pay attention to a specific auditory stimulus, we are more likely to transfer it from echoic memory to our working memory or long-term memory for further processing and storage. So echoic memory helps us to integrate sounds over a short time frame, allowing us to perceive speech and music as coherent and meaningful. So understanding echoic memory sheds light on how we process and make sense of the auditory world around us. And it plays a crucial role in our ability to follow conversations, to enjoy music, and of course to process complex auditory scenes. Now, as we continue and explore a little bit of the auditory processes, it's really essential to delve into how context plays a pivotal role in our ability to recognize auditory patterns. The brain really excels at making sense of auditory information by not just processing individual sounds in isolation, but by considering the broader context in which they occur. So we can think of terms of the context of auditory perception really encompasses a number of elements. First off, it involves the temporal context. So we can think in terms of the timing and sequence of sounds. The brain uses these temporal clues to distinguish between different phonemes in speech or music or rhythms. And so it's time dependent in its auditory pattern. Is also spectral information, and this refers to the frequency components of sound. So our brain can identify changes in pitch, in timbre, and other spectral characteristics to recognize musical melodies, speech intonation, and of course environmental sounds. There's also the semantic context, and this relates to the meaning and significance of sounds with a given context. For example, you hear the word bark in the context of a dog-related conversation versus a tree-related conversation can lead to very different interpretations of the exact same sound. Then there is the spatial location of sound, which also contributes to the auditory pattern recognition. So our ability to locate the source of the sound, where it's in front of us or behind us, helps us to navigate our environmental orientation effectively. So, of course, there's also the top-down, bottom-up processing that goes on. So auditory perception really heavily relies upon top-down processing, where our prior knowledge and expectations and context guide how we interpret and recognize sounds. For instance, if you're listening to a foreign language, your prior exposure to similar languages may help you to decipher some words based upon the context. Now, there are also auditory illusions. And so we just want to touch very quickly on these. You can kind of delve into the intriguing world of auditory illusions. But auditory illusions are really perceptual phenomena that challenge our understanding of how we interpret sounds. So auditory illusions really occur when our brains misinterpret or create auditory experiences that differ from the actual acoustic stimuli. One famous one is what is known as the shepherd tone illusion, and this auditory illusion creates the perception of an endlessly rising or falling pitch. Even though the tone is actually just looping, it often really is described as a bit of an auditory equivalent of an optical illusion of a rising staircase or something, because the sound just continually goes up, but it can be pretty annoying. Another famous auditory illusion is what is known as the McGurk effect. And this shows how the visual system can oftentimes override the auditory senses. So when you see a person saying one syllable, but you hear a different syllable, that's called the McGurk effect. And our brains often combine the visual and auditory information, and that leads to the perception of a completely different syllable, even though the sound has not changed. And that goes to show that different parts of our brain can override other parts. So, for example, our visual system can override our auditory processing and get us to hear things that did not actually occur. So those are just a few examples of the kinds of things that can go on within the auditory cortex. And I hope you enjoyed this part of our lecture, and I will see you next week. You take care. Goodbye.